On the morning of July 14, 1944, at precisely 9:42 a.m., First Lieutenant Evald Swanson found himself at the controls of a B-17G flying fortress named Mispa, staring into a nightmare of black smoke and exploding shells over the Hungarian capital of Budapest. The young pilot was just 24 years old, but already carried the weight of 17 combat missions on his shoulders. The statistics that every bomber crew member knew haunted their waking hours. Out of every 10 men who climbed into these four-engine giants, 8 would never make it back home. Some would die in the flames of destruction. Others would spend the rest of the war in German prison camps, and some would simply vanish without a trace. Their bodies never recovered from the skies over occupied Europe. The formation of 60 B-17s from the 483rd Bomb Group pressed forward through an absolute wall of anti-aircraft fire. More than 288 German guns had been positioned around the railway yards below, and they were all sending their deadly payloads skyward simultaneously. Shells burst in thick black clouds capable of shredding aircraft aluminum like it was paper. Mispa took hits in the tail section first, then the wings, shrapnel punching holes through the fuselage in a dozen different places. Yet somehow the bomber maintained its position in the formation. Behind Swanson in the cockpit sat Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt as co-pilot, while in the nose section, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier position, and Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson worked from the navigation compartment. 8 additional crew members filled the remaining stations throughout the aircraft: radio operators, gunners, and the flight engineer who kept the complex machine running. Seconds away from the target, Dudley released the bomb load and 2 tons of high explosives plummeted toward the railway yards. Below, the B-17 lurched upward as the tremendous weight fell away, and in that precise moment, an 88mm shell struck the nose of the aircraft with devastating precision. The explosion erased everything forward of the cockpit in an instant. The entire nose section simply ceased to exist, taking with it the bombardier station, the navigator position, the Norden bomb sight, and every plexiglass panel that had once given the crew their forward view. Both Dudley and Henderson died instantly, their bodies consumed by the fireball that tore through what remained of the aircraft's front end. The center of gravity shifted violently backward with the sudden loss of weight, and Mispa pitched up into a near-vertical climb that pushed the bomber toward a stall. Swanson could see nothing but sky where his flight instruments should have been. Air at -40 degrees Fahrenheit screamed through the enormous cavity where the nose had been, tearing at his flight suit and carrying with it the blood from crew members who had been standing in the destroyed compartments. The control yoke that connected to the flight control system had been mounted to the forward structure, and that structure no longer existed. Every instrument on his panel was gone because they had all been attached to the nose section. No airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon. Nothing but cold air and empty space where the cockpit instruments should have been. The only thing keeping Mispa airborne in those first desperate moments was the inherent stability that Boeing engineers had built into the design, and the sheer force of Swanson's determination to keep the aircraft level somehow. The steel control cables that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons remained intact, exposed now and hanging in the 300-mile-per-hour wind, but still connected to the flight surfaces that could save them all. The surviving crew members began moving forward through the aircraft, the radio operator and flight engineer picking their way past damaged structure toward the cockpit. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay, could see the wind tearing at the aircraft's innards, and understood immediately what needed to happen next. At 9:44 a.m., barely 2 minutes after the first explosion, a second 88mm shell struck engine number 2 on the right wing. The right cyclone radial engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments, its propeller windmilling for 3 seconds before seizing completely. Flames streaked back along the inboard wing, and Mispa found itself flying on 3 engines instead of the 4 it had been designed to use. Without the cockpit instruments, Swanson had absolutely no way to measure how fast they were falling behind the formation. As it continued toward the rally point over the Adriatic Sea, Technical Sergeant Frank G. Mancy, the flight engineer, made his way forward from the top turret position and immediately understood the crisis. The control cables ran through the fuselage in distinct bundles: elevator cables, rudder cables, and aileron cables, each about 3/8 of an inch in diameter steel wire rope that normally traveled through pulleys and fair leads hidden behind panels and structural members. Now every single cable was completely exposed to the wind, and without someone physically holding them steady and pulling them. When Swanson needed control input, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Semelli came up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell arrived from the waist gun position. They positioned themselves near the main cable runs in the bomb bay and understood without any discussion what their task would be. There was no debate about whether this was possible or sensible. The situation spoke for itself. Someone had to hold those cables. Someone had to physically pull them when the pilot needed to turn or climb or descend. The problem was that Swanson sat 40 feet forward in what remained of the cockpit, while the crew stood in the bomb bay area, and the intercom system had been damaged in the explosion. Communication would be nearly impossible. Swanson tried the rudder pedals and felt nothing. The pedals remained attached to the floor, but the cables they normally actuated were now being battered by wind that exceeded hurricane force. He tried the throttles and found that engines 1, 3, and 4 still responded, which was something at least. But without control over the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation and into a dive, or worse. It would pitch up again, stall, and spin into the earth. Either outcome meant death for everyone aboard. The crew began pulling on the cables, wrapping sections around their hands for grip. The steel was cold enough to burn through their gloves, cutting into their palms and fingers. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, MISPA's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators worked the same basic principle: pull back and the nose came up, release and it dropped. But every single input had to be timed perfectly. Too much pressure and the aircraft would over-respond violently. Too little pressure and nothing would happen at all. They performed these calculations and adjustments without being able to see what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, without any instruments or indicators to guide them. It was pure instinct, pure coordination, and pure desperation. MISPA continued falling behind the formation as the other B-17s maintained their cruise speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic coast and safety. The drag from the missing nose section was enormous, and with one destroyed engine providing less power, the crippled bomber simply could not keep pace. The formation could not wait for them. Every additional minute over Hungarian territory meant more exposure to enemy fighters and more anti-aircraft fire. Standard procedure was absolutely clear on this point. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., MISPA was completely alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2 miles, visible now only as dark shapes against the summer sky. Swanson's aircraft was losing altitude, not rapidly but steadily, and without any way to stop it. They had been at 30,000 feet over the target. Now they were at 29,000, then 28,000. The crew in the bomb bay kept pulling cables despite their cramping hands, despite the brutal cold cutting through their flight suits, despite the steel cutting off circulation in their palms. They kept pulling because stopping meant death. The fuel situation was completely unknown. Every gauge had been located on the instrument panel that no longer existed, and Swanson had absolutely no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. He did not know how long 3 engines could keep them airborne. He did not even know if they were heading in the correct direction towards safety. Navigation required instruments and maps, and the navigator, who was now dead somewhere over Budapest. The only direction Swanson knew for certain was southwest. Keep flying southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Reach the Adriatic. Reach Italy. Reach home. The crew in the bomb bay began waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft, but Swanson could not turn around to see what they were indicating. The wind pressure through the open nose cavity made any head movement dangerous. Unbuckling from the pilot's seat meant being pulled forward and out of the aircraft entirely. He remained locked in position, eyes on the horizon, trying to keep the wings level. but the crew kept waving with increasing urgency. Something was wrong in the rear section. Something beyond the missing nose, beyond the dead engine, beyond the exposed control cables that they had been pulling for the past 4 minutes. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker had been in the tail gunner position when the explosion occurred. The tail section was the most isolated spot on any B-17, a cramped compartment at the very rear of the fuselage accessible only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the aircraft pitch up violently during the initial explosion and had felt it stabilize, but now he was feeling something else entirely. The tail structure was flexing in ways that aluminum should never flex. The metal framework holding the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers was moving in patterns that indicated catastrophic structural failure was imminent. The explosion had created stress fractures somewhere in the fuselage, or shrapnel had weakened critical support members, but either way, the tail section was beginning to separate from the rest of the aircraft. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. A B-17 without its tail would enter an unrecoverable spin, tumbling end over end until it either disintegrated in the air or crashed into the ground below. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react, no time for final prayers or final thoughts of home. MISPA was now at 26,000 feet and still descending, still heading southwest, but with the aircraft's structural integrity failing around them. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5, though every second felt like an hour. The wind noise was absolutely deafening. The cold was penetrating every layer of his flight suit until it reached his bones. His hands on the throttles were going numb, but the throttles represented the only controls he could operate without the crew pulling cables. In the bomb bay behind him, engine power was his only remaining avenue for influencing the aircraft's behavior. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt remained in the co-pilot seat, his control column also gone, his instruments also destroyed, but he kept watch on the wings and the engines and the sky for any sign of German fighters. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were known to hunt lone bombers, and a damaged B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target, with no defensive firepower from neighboring aircraft and no mutual support. So far no fighters had appeared, either engaged elsewhere or simply not yet noticing the crippled American bomber losing altitude over occupied territory. The crew continued pulling cables and their coordination was slowly improving, despite the impossibility of communication. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft wanted to yaw right, and the crew compensated by pulling the left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again. This was not flying in any conventional sense. This was collective survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air, through nothing but determination and the laws of physics. At 9:50 a.m., MISPA crossed the border from Hungary into Yugoslavia. Though Swanson had no way of knowing this, he had no map and no recognizable landmarks through the gaping hole where his cockpit used to be. But the flak stopped. The black clouds of anti-aircraft explosions ceased. That meant they were out of the heaviest defensive zones. That meant they might have a chance, a small chance, a chance that depended entirely on how long the tail structure would hold together, how long the crew could keep pulling cables, and how long 3 engines could generate enough thrust to keep them airborne. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines running and feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly, which meant fuel was still flowing and the wing tanks were not yet empty. But exactly how much gasoline remained was completely unknown. B-17s carried 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks and at cruise power. 4 engines burned roughly to 100 gallons per hour. They were not at cruise power. They were at maximum continuous power on 3 engines trying to maintain altitude and airspeed, which meant fuel consumption was significantly higher. Swanson made his decision. The aircraft was dying. The tail structure was failing. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over occupied territory, and every additional minute in the air increased the risk of total structural failure. That would kill everyone aboard. If MISPA broke apart at altitude, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would survive the day. They would be captured and spend months in prisoner of war camps, but they would be alive. The problem was execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required careful coordination with specific exit points for different crew members. The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and others used the waist gun windows or the rear door. Each crew member had practiced these procedures dozens of times in training, but training had assumed the aircraft was intact, that the pilot could communicate over the intercom, that there was time to organize an orderly evacuation. Swanson had none of these things. He had no intercom, no way to give orders, no way to coordinate who would go first and who would go last, and he could not leave his position. The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull. The B-17 would enter a dive or a spin within seconds, and everyone still aboard would die down at 9:52 a.m. MISPA was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were locked on the throttles. His feet remained on the rudder pedals even though they did nothing. Without the crew pulling cables 30 feet behind him, Bernd sat motionless in the co-pilot's seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, watching for any sign of catastrophic failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say, and the wind noise made conversation impossible anyway. The crew in the bomb bay made their own decision. They could feel the tail structure flexing beneath their feet. They could see stress cracks spreading through the fuselage skin. They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft finally came apart. One by one, they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first, clipping his parachute harness, positioning himself at the window opening, and jumping into the slipstream that took him instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next, then Staff Sergeant George Semelli, then Technical Sergeant Frank G. Mency. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables meant less precise inputs. The B-17 began wallowing, wings dipping left then right, nose pitching up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttle settings to compensate, but throttle alone was not enough. He needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the crew pulling cables, but the crew was abandoning ship because staying meant death. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position, squeezing through the narrow passage, emerging in the waist gun area where he saw the empty positions, where his crewmates had been standing moments before. He saw the exposed control cables now slack without hands holding them. He saw the massive opening where the nose used to be 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated. 5 men were descending under parachute canopies over Yugoslav territory. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 men would survive the day. That left 5 men still aboard MISPA, Swanson in the pilot's seat, Bernd in the co-pilot seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached the exit points. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, still barely controllable, and the tail structure was about to fail completely.
The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish went through the waist gun window, his parachute deploying cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tecker followed seconds later. That left 3 men aboard: Swanson, Bernd, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable with almost no one pulling the control cables, responding only to engine power and the inherent aerodynamic stability that Boeing engineers had designed into the B-17. Stability meant for normal flight conditions, not for flight without a nose section, not for flight with a failing tail structure. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area and jumped, disappearing into the slipstream. Swanson and Bernd were now alone, 2 men in the remains of a B-17 Flying Fortress, at 20,000 feet over Yugoslav territory. The bomber continued descending with 3 engines still running, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. It stayed in the air through a combination of residual stability and the fact that the wings were still generating lift, but without crew members pulling cables, any significant control input was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Bernd. No words were exchanged, and the wind noise would have drowned out any conversation, but the message was clear. Bernd needed to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls, no function, no purpose in remaining. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or crashed. The only rational choice was to bail out while altitude remained, while there was still time to deploy a parachute and survive the landing. Bernd unbuckled his harness, stood up from the co-pilot's seat, and moved carefully toward the rear of the flight deck, where he could access the main fuselage and reach the waist gun exit. He looked back at Swanson one final time, the pilot still locked in position with hands on throttles and eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as possible. Bernd climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and headed aft. 30 seconds later, he jumped.
Evald Swanson was now completely alone, one man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was falling at approximately 200 feet per minute, not a dive but a steady descent. The three remaining engines produced enough thrust to maintain forward speed but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created massive drag, the aerodynamic profile was destroyed, and the B-17 was essentially a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation remained completely unknown. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty with no way to tell. Wright Cyclone engines ran smoothly until the fuel supply was completely exhausted, at which point they simply stopped with no warning, no sputtering, just sudden silence. If all three engines quit simultaneously, MISPA would drop out of the sky. Swanson estimated their position based on their heading and time since leaving Budapest. They had been flying southwest for approximately 14 minutes at around 180 miles per hour, covering roughly 40 to 45 miles. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was about 30 miles from Budapest, so they were likely over Yugoslav territory now, possibly approaching the mountains, possibly approaching the Adriatic coast. But all of this was pure guesswork. Without instruments, without maps, without a navigator, he was flying completely blind. The question was how long to stay aboard. Every additional minute at the controls meant the crew members below had more time to distance themselves from the crash site, more time to avoid German patrols that would search for a down bomber. But staying aboard also meant increased risk of dying in the crash. The tail structure was still flexing. The bomber could break apart at any moment. And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit point, and jump, all while the B-17 was uncontrolled and potentially entering a death spiral.
At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his final decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. That would give the crew more separation distance, more chance to avoid capture or find partisan help. Then he would go. He kept his hands on the throttles as the 3 Wright Cyclone engines continued their steady roar. Engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right wing, engine number 4 on the far right wing, all running smoothly, all consuming fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At 10 a.m. exactly, Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, he felt the wind pressure trying to pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose used to be. He pushed back against his seat, then stood up carefully. The aircraft immediately began to pitch. Without anyone controlling the throttles or making corrections, MISPA started a gentle left roll.
Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck, squeezing through the narrow crawlway that led to the bomb bay area. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped. The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay, no hands pulling them now, no one holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive. He had maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before the G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft entered a spin. He reached the waist gun area where the aluminum floor was vibrating under his boots and the wind noise was overwhelming. He grabbed his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening. The bomber was diving now, not vertically but steeply enough that Swanson had to brace himself against the fuselage to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked out at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical wall, spinning him sideways. The B-17 flashed past, engine still roaring, already 200 feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the rip cord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs, followed by relative silence as the roar of the engines faded. He watched the bomber fall, the tail section still attached but barely, the entire rear fuselage flexing like a reed in the wind. At 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The B-17's forward section pitched nose down almost vertically and fell for another 8 seconds before disappearing into a line of trees 2 miles away. A column of black smoke rose moments later as the fuel tanks ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. If Swanson had stayed aboard for another 30 seconds, he would be dead.
The parachute descent was slow, as Swanson drifted southwest with the prevailing wind. Below him, the Yugoslav landscape showed scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down there were German occupation forces. Somewhere down there were his crew members who had jumped minutes before him. Somewhere down there was the reality that his war was over, that he was about to become a prisoner of the enemy he had been bombing. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson tried to steer the parachute toward an open field, but canopies were not designed for precision maneuvering. The trees were directly below him now. He hit the upper branches at approximately 15 miles per hour, branches snapping around him, the parachute canopy catching on limbs as he crashed through the foliage, and slammed into a thick branch with his left side. He felt his left leg break, the bones snapping cleanly somewhere between the knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet and came to a stop, tangled in parachute mines and broken branches 15 feet above the ground. Blood ran down his leg, his flight suit was torn. Deep lacerations covered his left thigh, where branches had cut through fabric and skin. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move it, could not put weight on it, could not climb down from the tree. He hung there in the parachute harness, trying to control the pain, trying to stay conscious.
Below him, he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers arrived at the base of the tree within minutes, Wehrmacht infantry from an occupation unit stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes descending, had heard the crash of the B-17, and now they were collecting American aircrew. Swanson hung motionless in his harness, unable to move, unable to escape. The soldiers found a ladder from a nearby farm. 2 men climbing up and cutting the parachute lines, lowering Swanson carefully to avoid worsening his leg injury. A German medic arrived and examined the broken leg, the lacerations, the blood loss. He applied a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth, then injected morphine from a medical kit. The pain began to fade as the drug took effect, dulling the sharp agony to a distant throb. The medic wrapped the deep cuts with bandages, checked for other injuries, confirmed that ribs seemed intact with no head trauma and no detectable internal bleeding. The primary concern was the leg. Without proper treatment, infection would set in. Without surgery, the bone might not heal correctly. But for now, the medic had done what he could with limited supplies in a forest clearing. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post, then to a Wehrmacht medical facility where a German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the fracture, and set the bone properly. The procedure was painful despite the morphine, and Swanson passed out twice during the process. When he regained consciousness, his leg was in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. The doctor explained through an interpreter that the fracture was clean and the bone would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mispa's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None had evaded capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled by German forces, and though partisan resistance groups operated in the mountains, the crew had landed in farmland under direct enemy control. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive: Burnt, Gemensi, Simeli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, all alive, all uninjured except for minor cuts and bruises, all now prisoners of war. They were transported to Stalag Luft 4 in Austria, a facility specifically designated for captured Allied aircrew and home to approximately 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. The barracks were cold in winter, and medical care was minimal, but the Germans generally followed Geneva Convention protocols for officer prisoners. There were no mass executions and no systematic torture, just confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches. The cast came off in September 1944. Physical therapy was basic, but he walked around the camp perimeter every day, rebuilding strength in the damaged leg. By October, he could walk without assistance. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered, but the war continued, and the camp remained locked, with guards patrolling the wire. The crew of Mispa settled into the routine of captivity, talking about the mission, about the 88mm shell, about the 10 minutes they flew without a cockpit, about pulling the control cables by hand, about watching their bomber fall into the Yugoslav forest, about Dudley and Henderson, who died instantly when the nose exploded, about how close they all came to dying that day. They waited for the war to end, waited for liberation, waited to go home. Winter turned to spring as the Germans began evacuating camps as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns, with deteriorating conditions, food becoming scarce, some men dying during the forced marches, while others escaped in the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together, marching through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. On April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany as American tanks rolled past and soldiers distributed food, water, and cigarettes. The crew of Mispa went home. All 8 survivors, all 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest, all 8 men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Ewald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan, married, raised a family, worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he would only say that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a pilot who had done his job under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed, promoting him over the following years until he eventually retired as lieutenant colonel. The recognition was not for a single mission, but for a career of service, though that single mission remained the defining moment of his life: the 10 minutes without a cockpit, the 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in contact, attending 483rd Bomb Group reunions, gathering every few years to remember the war, the missions, and the men who did not return. The bond between them was unbreakable. They had survived something that should not have been survivable, had flown a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and bare control cables exposed to 300-mile-per-hour wind. They had done it through coordination, through determination, through the simple refusal to give up. And they had honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Evald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 91, having lived a full life and seen the world change from propeller-driven bombers to jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mispa, the B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest, the bomber that flew on borrowed time and crew determination, the aircraft that proved human will could overcome engineering limits.